We continue now at the top of Daf Samach Aleph Amud Beis in Meseches Bava Metzia. This is Bava Metzia Daf 61b. On the previous summit, the Gemara asked, why do we need a lav by gezela? Can't we learn it out from a combination of ona and ribis? And the Gemara said, indeed, you can learn it out from a combination of ona and ribis. And the reason why we have a lav by gezela is to say that there are two negative commandments when it comes to kovesh sechar sachir, when it comes to withholding a worker's wages. The Gemara says, well, if the lav of a gezela is just to give a second lav to something, how do you know it's a second lav to kovesh sechar sachir? Maybe it's a second lav to ona, for example. Maybe it's a second lav to ribis, for example. And so the Gemara answers, it goes by the context. Uveinyana de sachar ksiv. It says that it's in the context of wages of a worker that we see the lav of lo sigzol. Rashi says uveinyana de schirus ksiv lav de gezel. That's where it has the lav of gezel. Lo sashok v'lo sigzol v'choleshek kvisha schar sachir. When it says lo sashok, that refers to withholding wages. It says lo sashok and lo sigzol in the same context. That's how we know that it's for a second lav for withholding wages. And the Gemara continues, lo signovu de kasav rachmana lamli. So why do we need lo signovu? We were just dealing with gezela. Again, genev is when the person is doing it in secret. Why does it have to have a lav for that? Isn't that obvious? Rashi says, lo signovu de kasav rachmana lamli leilef me ribis ve'ona. You should learn it out again. Same question as before. Learn it out from the combination of ribis and ona. Shari mechas romamon, because he's causing him to lose money. Rashi says, lo signov da aseres hadibros lo kami boile. We're not asking about the lo signov that we find in the aseres hadibros, the azhara legonev nefashasu, because that's actually a warning in terms of stealing people, kidnapping essentially, kidamrinan b'sanhedrin, like we say in Sanhedrin. So that's why the Gemara specifically is talking about lo signovu. In any case, what's the purpose of lo signovu? The Gemara says, l'chidetanya, it's for the following brisa, lo signovu al menas l'meikat. It says lo signovu. It means, let's say the person is even just doing it to aggravate the person. That's also a violation of the lav. And lo signovu al menas l'sham tashlum kefil. Let's say a person wants to steal just in order to pay the kefil to the person. That he knows the person is not going to accept the gift, so he figures I'll steal in order to give him the gift. So that's lo signovu. You can't steal just in order to pay the kefil. Rashi says lamekat letzayir, again in order to pain the person, in order to bother the person. Al menas l'sham tashlum kefil sharotza lahano. So that means to say he wants to pay kefil because he wants to benefit the person. The odea bo shelo yikabel, he knows the person is not going to accept the gift, so he wants to do al menas l'sham kefil. That is also going to be a problem. And the Gemara continues, Amar le Rav Yemar le Rav Ashi. Rav Yemar said to Rav Ashi, Lav de kasav rachmana b'mishkalos lamali. Why do we need a negative commandment? Why does the Torah need to write a negative commandment by mishkalos when it comes to weight? When it comes to weights, the Gemara says, Amar le said back to him, L'tomin mishkalosav b'melech. That's to say that you're not allowed to bury the weights in salt. As we'll see in Rashi, that makes the weights heavier. Some Rishonim say it makes the weights lighter, but essentially saying you can't cheat when it comes to the weights. But the Gemara says, Hainu gezel mi'aliyah. So that's actually gezel mi'aliyah. That's a regular case of gezel. Why would we need an additional pasuk for that? If you have weights that are false, you're essentially stealing. And the Gemara says to that, lav or olav mishas asiyah. The reason for the pasuk is to say that you transgress from the moment that you do that. When you put them in the salt, even though you haven't actually executed the stealing yet, you haven't actually used the weights, it is still going to be a violation of that lav. And Rashi says, Lav de mishkalos lo sasu avel, quotes the pasuk, L'tomin mishkalosov means somebody's going to bury his weights, hamana or apras, tomin b'melech, he buries the weight in salt, lahachbido, to make it heavier, ukashu lokayach b'mishkal lokayach belo. Then when he's purchasing, when he's doing it with weights, he uses these weights in order to benefit himself. Again, other Rishonim argue with Rashi and say that the salt actually lightens the weights. Then we'd be talking about the seller. Mishas asiyah, from the time that it's done, mishas hatmana, means it's already a violation from the time that you buried in the salt, v'afilu lo shakal ben, even if you didn't weigh anything with them, it's going to be a violation of this lav. And the Gemara continues, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Lo sasu aval b'mishpat b'mida b'mishkalu v'mesura. The pasuk says you cannot be corrupt in judgment in terms of measurements, and the Gemara explains what the various measurements are. The Brisa says b'mida. What does it mean b'mida? Zum medidas karka. That refers to measuring of land. Let's say two people are dividing up land. Shelo yimdod le'echad b'mos hachamu li'echad b'mos hagasham. You shouldn't measure for one in the summer season and then measure the other using the rope in the rainy season, because again, depending on the weather, that changes the length of the rope. But mishkal, when it comes to weights, shelo yatmin mishkalosu b'melech, he shouldn't put his weights into salt, as we said above. Uva mesura, and what does it mean mesura? Shelo yarsiach, that's talking about volumes. When you're talking about liquid, you shouldn't froth the liquid in order to make it look larger than it is. And the Gemara continues, valo dvarim kal v'chomer, isn't it a kal v'chomer? Uma mesura shi echad mishloshim belug, if mesura, which is 1/30 of a lug, hikpida olav Torah, the Torah is makbid, not to cheat on that kind of measurement, even though it's so small. Kal v'chomer lehin v'chatzihin u'shlish ahin u'revius ahin v'lug v'chatzi lug u'revius halug. So it's a kal v'chomer, all these other measurements which are larger than that amount that you have to be careful not to cheat in terms of the measurements. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rava, Rava says, Lamali dekasav rachmani yitzias mitzrayim beribis, yitzias mitzrayim gabei tzitzis, yitzias mitzrayim b'mishkolos. Why does the pasuk write the yitzias mitzrayim when it talks about ribis, that a person is warned not to lend with interest? It also says yitzias mitzrayim by the mitzvah of tzitzis, and it also says yitzias mitzrayim when it talks about weights, that the weights have to be true weights, and you can't have false measurements. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's because HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Ani u'shevchanti b'Mitzrayim, I was able to distinguish in Mitzrayim bein tipa shel bechor, between a drop of a bechor, letipa she'ena shel bechor, to a drop that was not a bechor, meaning I was able to distinguish between which person was a bechor and which one was not, in terms of makas bechoros. So Ani hu shasa lipara mimi shetola ma'osa benachri, I'm also the one who in the future will be able to punish somebody who says that his money really is the money of a non-Jew, u'malvo samli Yisrael b'ribis, and he thereby lends it to a Jew with interest. Essentially, he tries to circumvent the issue of ribis, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows what is really going on. That's the idea. Also, somebody who buries his weights in salt. Again, a person's going to try to cheat in terms of the weights. HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows. And also somebody who has kol ilan in his garment, that refers to the tcheles. Instead of using the proper dye for the tcheles, the person uses kol ilan, which is indigo. V'yomer tcheles, so he says it's tcheles, and again, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is able to tell what is tcheles and what is not. And Rashi explains, Lo yimdod le'echad b'mos acham, you shouldn't measure for one person in the summer season, meaning achin haboin la'achlok es hasad, let's say brothers are dividing a field. Lo yimdod hamodeh le'echad b'mos acham, the person measuring shouldn't measure out for one of them in the summer season, u'le'echad b'mos hageshamim, and then for the other one in the rainy season, but also hacheva with the same rope, mimnei sha'acheva lach b'mos hageshamim, because the rope is moist in the rainy season, u'mispasha kol sarchu, it stretches out more, of yimos acham mitoch yovsho, hu nigmar v'chavitz, in the summer season, because it's dry, it gets smaller. Mesura is midas halachi. Mesura is a kind of volume. It's used for liquids. Yarsiach shememali is hamid. Again, yarsiach, when you're frothing the liquid, it makes it a little larger in terms of volume. Kishmotzias ayayin ulachar zman nimtzas chaseir. But after some time passes, it ends up being less. Yitzias Mitzrayim gabe ribis beparshas Bahar Sinai. Yitzias Mitzrayim is found again written by ribis. Gabe mishkolos b'kedoshim tiyu. In kedoshim we find Yitzias Mitzrayim by mishkolos. And the Gemara said, Shevchanti b'Mitzrayim, I was able to tell him Mitzrayim, meaning HaKadosh Baruch Hu, could tell him Mitzrayim, Hari Shabo Asar Revokim al Mitzras Achas. Let's say you have 10 men with one Egyptian woman, V'nesabra mehen, she becomes pregnant, Be'eser Ibur, in 10 pregnancies, Eser Bechoros, it's going to be 10 firstborns. Shein Bechoros Shalavi, and they're considered the firstborn of their father. Kulan Mesu, they would all die in Makas Bechoros. Tola Ma'osa Benachri, somebody says his money is really a non-Jew's money, meaning Malva Ma'osav L'Yisrael B'Ribis, he lends his money to a Jew for interest. V'yomer Shal but he says actually it's money that belongs to a non-Jew. And Kala Ilan, he uses indigo, Tseva Hadoma L'Tcheles. This is a dye that's similar to the color of Tcheles. For Rachman Amar Psil Tcheles, the pasuk says Psil Tcheles, or Tcheles, Dam of Yikarim. Now Tcheles is very expensive. Shet Savua B'dam Chilazon, because you're using the dam of the Chilazon. She'eno Olam in Hayam Ela'achas L'Shivim Shan, it only comes up from the sea once every 70 years. And again, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is able to distinguish. And the Gemara continues, Ravina ikla l'sura depras. Ravina went to Surah on the Euphrates River. Amar le Rav Chanina misura depras l'Ravina. Rav Chanina from Surah depras said to Ravina, Yitzias Mitzrayim dekazav rachmana gabe shrotzim lamali. Why does it talk about Yitzias Mitzrayim when the pasuk is speaking about shrotzim, about creeping animals, that you shouldn't become impure and you shouldn't eat creeping animals? Amar le said to him, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Aniu shevchanti ben tipa shel bechor letipa she'ena shel bechor. I was able to distinguish between the drop of a bechor and the drop of one who is not a bechor. And I'm also going to punish somebody who mixes the innards of impure fish with the innards of pure fish. Then he sells them to the Jew who's not able to distinguish. So again, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I am able to distinguish and punish such a person. Amar Lei said to him, I wasn't asking why it just talks about Yitzias Mitzrayim, but why it uses the language of Hamala, brought up from Mitzrayim. What's the difference over here? It doesn't say he took out of Mitzrayim, but he says who brought us up from Mitzrayim. Why does the pasuk say it in that way? Amar Le, so he said to him, the reason why it says it in that fashion is for the teaching in the yeshiva of Rabbi Yishmael, the Tana de Rabbi Yishmael, because it was taught in the yeshiva of Rabbi Yishmael. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, if I would have brought Klal Yisrael out of Mitzrayim just for this, that they're not going to become impure with creeping animals, that would have been sufficient. Amar Lei said to him, Umi nafish agrayu tfeime ribis, umi tzitzis, umi mishkalos, is the reward for avoiding the creeping animals, is that more of a reward than for avoiding ribis, and for doing tzitzis properly, and for using proper weights? Amar Lei, he said back to him, Afagav, the lo nafish agrayu, even though the reward is not more, but tfeime isil mechlin, even though it's not more reward, but it's disgusting to eat them, and that's why it's something that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is saying it's good to keep away from. And Rashi explains, Surah de Pras, Surah HaYosheves al Nahar Pras, this is the surah that is by the Euphrates River. Ve'enzu Surah Stam, this is not the same as the place that's generally referred to as Surah. Gabe Shratzim, by creeping animals, B'vayhi bayom hashmini ki ani Hashem hamala eschem me'eretz Mitzrayim. So it says in Parsha Shmini that I brought you up from Eretz Mitzrayim. And Rashi continues, Ela b'shvil davar zeh, just for this, kidim mefarish l'kamei, as the Gemara will explain further on, shehin me'ulim v'noim ve'enon nimasim b'shkatzim halolu, meaning it's good, it's considered elevated, that you're not disgusted, that you don't make yourselves disgusting with these creeping animals. Lahachi kasav lashon Eloi, that's why it's a language of Eloi. Shamala gadol hi etzlam, again, it's like an elevated level when it comes to Klal Yisrael in this regard. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Ve'ezo tarbis, what's considered to be ribis, hamarbe beperos, if somebody increases when it comes to produce. Ketzad, how so? Lakachemenu chitim bedinar zav v'chulu, a person buys wheat at the price of a dinar zav, and then again we said that the wheat goes up in value, etc. The Mishnah goes on to describe the case. The Gemara says, Atu kol hani diamina ad hashta lav ribisu, but all the cases we gave until now in the Mishnah are not cases of ribis. It sounds like it's saying that from here forward is a case of ribis, but we had other cases of ribis in the Mishnah. And so the Gemara answers what we said earlier. Amar Rabbi Avo says, Ad kan shel Torah, until the Mishnah gets to the line of Ezehu tarbis, that's talking about ribis d'oraisa. Mikan va'elach shel devreim, but then from that point forward in the Mishnah, we're talking about ribis d'Rabbanan. V'chein amar Rav, and similarly Rava says, Ad kan shel Torah, until here is ribis d'oraisa. Mikan va'elach shel devreim, from here forward is ribis d'Rabbanan. Ad kan yochin rosha v'yilbash tzadik, until this point, the rosha prepares and the tzadik wears. And the Gemara asks on that, Ad kan v'sulo, only until here and not further. Ela afilu ad kan, it means to say even until here, Yachin Rasha, the wicked prepares, v'yilbash tzaddik, and the tzaddik will wear it. We'll see Rashi what this means in a moment. And finally the Gemara says, Ad kan ribis kitzutza, until here is what we call ribis kitzutza, that is a set kind of ribis, as the Gemara will discuss whether that kind of ribis needs to be returned. Mikan va'elach, but from this point of the Mishnah onward, avak ribis, we're talking about something that is a hint of ribis, meaning it's not outright ribis. And Rashi explains, Ad hashta hamal v'sela b'chamisha dinar, meaning to say, let's say a person lends a seller for 5 dinar, meaning at the outset, the terms of the loan are essentially interest, that I'm lending you a certain amount of money, that you, the borrower, should pay back more money. So that's already shel Torah, that's already considered a deoraisa kind of ribis, because derech halva, that's by way of a loan, as opposed to, as the Mishnah continues, you have derech mekach umemkar, so that's not considered ribis deoraisa. And then the Gemara said, Ad kan yochin rasha v'yilbash tzadik. Until here, the rasha prepares and the tzaddik wears, meaning she'im meis. What that means to say is as follows. Let's say the person who lent with interest dies, v'hiniach lebanav mos shel ribis, and he leaves over to his sons money that is money of ribis, money of interest. So the halach is ein chayovin lahachzir. The halach is the Yarshim, those sons, they don't need to return the interest. On this kind of ribis, it says that the Rasha prepares it, but he doesn't benefit from the interest. The interest is actually worn by his sons, that's the tzaddik. That's what we learn in the Tosefta. The Gemara then asked on that, well, what does that mean? Ad kan v'sulo, meaning only the ribis d'oraisa, the sons don't have to return. But to me, the Gemara is asking this like a question. Certainly if it's just ribis d'Rabbanan, the son does not need to return. And so the Gemara says that's true. Afilu ad kan, meaning even until here. Meaning the ribis d'oraisa, even in a situation of ribis d'oraisa, even there, yachin ha'avshu rasha v'yamos v'lo yena, the father will prepare, he's wicked, he'll die, he won't get the benefit. V'haben shu tzadik eino chayv l'achzer, and the son who's righteous will not need to return it. And finally, the Gemara said, Ad kan ribis kitzutza, until here is what we call ribis kitzutza, that's the set kind of ribis. V'kofen oso bezin lahachzir, and that means to say that bezin will force him to return it. Im tovo b'chayev, if he claims it from him in his lifetime, that's ribis kitzutza, masha'enkein, that is not the case by avak ribis. And the Gemara continues with a machlokas amoraim on this point. Amar Rebbe Elazar says, Ribis ketzutza yotza b'dayanin, when it comes to set ribis, again like the ribis doraisa, so that the judges are able to take it away from the person and return it to the borrower. But avak ribis, but when it comes to avak ribis, what's called a hint of ribis, the ribis derabanan, eino yotza b'dayanin, so that the judges are not able to take back from the lender and give it to the borrower. That's the opinion of Rebbe Elazar. Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Rabbi Yochanan says, afilu ribis ketzutza, it's not true. Even ribis ketzutza, nami, also that eino yotza b'dayanin, the judges are not able to take it from the lender to give it back to the borrower. And the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak says, my time with Rabbi Yochanan, what's the reason of Rabbi Yochanan? Why does he say that the judges can't take the ribis ketzutza? The Amar Kra, because the pasuk says, B'neshech nasan v'tarbis lokach, v'chai lo yichyes kol atoevos ha'ela asa. Pasuk there is talking about ribis, and it talks about misa, it talks about a punishment of death, and therefore the Gemara understands that to mean lemisa nitan v'lo laheshavon. It's something that's given over to a punishment of death, but it's not something that can be returned. Rashi says, v'chei lo yichya sefer dekram, mos yumas damav bo'yeh, at the end of the pasuk, talks about he shall surely die. And the Gemara continues, Ravad Barava says, Amar Krotz, because the pasuk says, Al tikach meito neshech v'sarbis v'yoreisam elokech. It says you shouldn't take interest, you have to fear God, and therefore we understand from that, lemora nitan, it's an issue given over for fear, v'lo laheshavon, it's not something that can be returned. Rava says, Migufe de crush mele. We see it from the pasuk itself. It says, Mos yumas dam of bo. It says he'll surely die. So we understand that to mean Mos yumas dam of bo yeh. Hukshu malve ribis l'shov chidam. And we understand that pasuk to be comparing those who lend for interest to those who spill blood, those who kill. Mashov chidamim lo nitnu laheshavan. Just like those who kill, it's not something that can be returned. Af malve ribis, so to one who lends with interest, lo nitnu laheshavan. It's not something that can be returned. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, my time with Rebbe Elazar, what's the reason of Rebbe Elazar? Again, Rebbe Elazar said that ribis ketzutza could be yotze b'dayanin as opposed to avak ribis. The Amar Krotz, because the pasuk says, and Rashi explains, Migufe dekra, again, this was the opinion of Rava, we learn it out from the pasuk itself, to v'neshech nasan the Yechezkel, this is the pasuk of v'neshech nasan, found in Sefer Yechezkel, nafkale behedya, we learn it out explicitly, midechsiv dam of boyeh, since it says in the pasuk, dam of boyeh, hukshu l'shofech dam, you see that it's compared to one who spills blood, kolomar damim sheshafach, meaning the blood that he spilled, sheheni es chaveru, Rashi understands it to mean that he made his friend poor by lending through interest, umeis borav, and then that person dies in famine, all of Yeshuvu, that's going to return to him, that's going to come back upon him, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Samech Beis Amud Aleph.